Flying should be a peaceful experience, just a few hours in the air, getting from one place to another. But sometimes, people bring their worst attitudes on board, and when that happens, things can take a shocking turn. It all started on a packed flight, just as passengers were settling into their seats. Among them was a middle-aged black man, quietly minding his own business in his assigned spot. Across the aisle sat an elderly woman, her expression sour as she eyed him with an unmistakable look of disapproval. At first, it seemed like she was just another grumpy traveler, but within minutes, it became clear she had a serious problem with the man sitting near her. The tension started small, huffs, eye rolls, and irritated glances, but then the real drama unfolded. She mumbled something under her breath, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Then she escalated, raising her voice and demanding that the flight attendants move her seat, claiming she couldn't possibly sit near someone like him. Gasps filled the cabin as nearby passengers exchanged stunned looks. The black man, calm but clearly taken aback, simply asked, "What exactly is the problem, ma'am?" But instead of answering, she doubled down, her words growing nastier. The flight attendants rushed over, trying to defuse the situation, but the woman refused to back down. Her voice carried through the plane, dripping with entitlement and prejudice, making everyone deeply uncomfortable. People were watching, recording, capturing every second of her outburst. It was clear she believed she could get away with it. But then, just when it seemed like she had full control of the moment, something happened that no one saw coming. In the next 5 minutes, karma would strike in the most unexpected way, and let's just say, she was about to learn a lesson she would never forget. The cabin buzzed with an uneasy energy. Passengers shifted in their seats, some whispering to each other, while others simply stared in shock. The flight attendants, trying to remain professional, urged the woman to calm down, but she was having none of it. Her face twisted in anger as she insisted that she shouldn't have to sit near someone like him. The black man, still composed, took a deep breath. His hands rested on his lap, his posture relaxed, but there was something in his eyes, something that showed he had been through this kind of situation before. He wasn't about to let this woman ruin his flight, but at the same time, he wasn't going to let her disrespect go unnoticed. He simply asked, "What exactly is your issue with me?" His voice was steady, polite, but firm. The woman scoffed and turned to the flight attendant, acting as if he wasn't even there. "I pay for this seat," she snapped, "and I don't feel comfortable sitting next to him. Just move me already." The flight attendant, a young woman who had clearly dealt with difficult passengers before, took a deep breath. "Ma'am, we cannot move people based on personal preferences," she said, her voice measured. "If you'd like to switch seats, you'll have to find someone willing to trade with you." The woman's face turned red. She looked around, searching for an ally, someone who would agree with her and offer up their seat. But instead, all she saw were blank stares, people shaking their heads in disbelief. No one was going to help her. A man 2 rows back muttered, "Unbelievable," while a woman near the front pulled out her phone, already recording. A few passengers were whispering, and some were already typing furiously on their screens, no doubt posting about the incident online. The air grew heavier, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The black man remained calm, refusing to engage in her hostility. The flight attendant sighed, looking toward the front of the plane. Something was about to happen, something that would change the course of this flight in ways no one expected. The woman's frustration was now impossible to ignore. Her face tightened as she realized no one was coming to her defense. The murmurs around her only fueled her anger, and she suddenly pointed at the flight attendant. "This is unacceptable. I demand to speak to the pilot," she snapped, her voice sharp enough to turn heads. The flight attendant, still maintaining her professionalism, gave a tight-lipped smile. "Ma'am, the pilot is currently preparing for takeoff. If you have a concern, I suggest you remain calm, or we may have to take further action." Her tone was polite, but there was an unmistakable warning in her words. The woman let out a dramatic sigh and crossed her arms, as if she had just been personally wronged. "I shouldn't have to put up with this," she muttered under her breath. Meanwhile, the black man sat quietly, his patience remarkable. He wasn't engaging, wasn't reacting, yet his presence alone seemed to set her off even more. A younger woman in the row behind them, who had been silently watching the whole thing, finally spoke up. "Ma'am, why don't you just sit down and let us all have a peaceful flight?" she said, her voice calm but firm. The older woman whipped her head around, eyes blazing. "Excuse me. You don't get to tell me what to do, young lady." The young woman didn't flinch. "I think we all just want to get where we're going without any drama," she replied, nodding toward the other passengers. Around them, heads bobbed in agreement. People were clearly fed up. But instead of backing down, the woman became more agitated. "I have the right to feel comfortable," she huffed, her voice rising again. At that moment, another flight attendant approached from the front of the plane. He leaned in and whispered something to the first attendant, who nodded, her expression unreadable. Then she turned back to the woman and said, "Ma'am, I need you to come with me for a moment." A few passengers gasped. The woman's eyes widened. "Come with you? Why? I haven't done anything wrong," she protested. The tension in the air grew even thicker. The black man finally lifted his gaze, his expression unreadable. The plane was silent, waiting, as the moment stretched into something bigger than anyone had expected. Something was about to shift, but no one knew just how much. The entire plane was watching now. The murmurs had died down, replaced by a heavy silence. The woman's face turned red as she stared at a flight attendant in disbelief. "Why should I have to go anywhere?" she demanded. "I'm the one being made uncomfortable here." The flight attendant didn't waver. "Ma'am, please step to the front of the plane," she repeated, her voice steady but firm. The woman gripped the armrests of her seat, refusing to budge. "This is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath. She turned to the black man as if searching for some reaction, but he remained still, his expression unreadable. He had barely spoken throughout the entire ordeal, yet somehow his silence made her even angrier. A few rows ahead, a man whispered, "She really thinks she can get away with this." A couple of passengers started recording, their phones angled just enough to capture the moment. The tension in the air felt almost suffocating. The flight attendants exchanged glances. It was clear that if she didn't cooperate soon, things were about to escalate. Then suddenly, a deep voice cut through the silence. "Is there a problem here?" A tall, broad-shouldered man in uniform had appeared near the front of the cabin. His presence alone made the energy in the plane shift. He was a senior flight official, and from the look on his face, he wasn't there to negotiate. The woman stiffened. She opened her mouth as if to argue, but for the first time, hesitation flickered in her eyes. "I was just asking for a seat change," she said, her voice a little quieter now. The official didn't blink. "You have two choices. Either you come with us now and discuss this issue privately, or we will be forced to take further action." Passengers exchanged glances. The black man exhaled slowly, still composed, but there was something in his eyes, like he already knew how this would end. The woman's fingers tightened around her armrest. She could feel the weight of 100 eyes on her. The tension in the air was unbearable. Something was about to happen, something that would change the course of this flight completely. The cabin felt like it was holding its breath. The woman's fingers were still gripping the armrest, her knuckles turning white. She glanced around the plane, searching for someone, anyone, who might come to her defense. But no one did. All she saw were blank stares, disapproving glances, and a few phones still recording. She had lost control of the moment, and she knew it. Just when it seemed like she might finally stand up and comply, she did something no one expected. Instead of following the flight official's instructions, she leaned back in her seat and folded her arms. "This is discrimination," she said loudly. "I have rights, and I'm not moving." A ripple of murmurs spread through the plane. A few passengers shook their heads, others whispered to one another. The flight official sighed, clearly prepared for this kind of behavior. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Ma'am, this is not a debate. This is your final warning." Before he could finish, the woman suddenly turned her attention back to the black man, her eyes filled with frustration. "You're just sitting there, enjoying this, aren't you?" she snapped. "You think you've won?" The man, who had remained quiet through it all, slowly lifted his gaze. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm but firm. "Ma'am, I don't need to win anything," he said. "You've already lost." The words hung in the air, cutting through the tension like a blade. The woman opened her mouth to argue, but before she could, another voice interrupted. "I think she should be removed," someone called from the back of the plane. A few heads turned. Then another voice chimed in. "Yeah, we all pay for this flight. We don't need this kind of negativity." Suddenly, a wave of agreement rippled through the cabin. People were speaking up, nodding, even clapping. The woman's face went pale. This wasn't how she thought this would go. She had assumed people would take her side, that someone would support her. But now the entire plane was against her. The flight official exchanged a look with the attendants, then nodded. "All right," he said, reaching for his radio. "We'll be making a decision." The woman's breathing quickened. "Wait," she said, her voice shaky. But it was too late. Something was about to happen, something she never saw coming. The woman's face drained of color as the flight official spoke into his radio. "We have a non-compliant passenger," he said calmly. "Prepare for removal." A stunned silence fell over the plane. Passengers glanced at each other, some in disbelief, others nodding in approval. The woman blinked rapidly, as if she couldn't process what was happening. "Wait," she stammered, her voice cracking. "You can't. This is ridiculous. I just wanted a different seat." The flight attendant didn't respond. Instead, she gestured for the woman to stand. The woman's breathing grew uneven. She looked around one last time, hoping for someone to defend her. But no one did. Then, just as she finally started to rise from her seat, another voice rang out from the front of the plane. "Actually, that won't be necessary." All eyes turned as a man in a pilot's uniform stepped forward. His presence alone commanded attention. He had been observing the situation from the cockpit door, and now he was walking directly toward the woman. His face was unreadable, but his next words changed everything. "She won't be removed," he said, pausing for effect, "because she's already on the no-fly list." Gasps echoed through the cabin. The woman's mouth fell open. "What?" she choked out. "That's impossible." The pilot nodded. "Ma'am, you were flagged before boarding, but it hadn't been processed yet. We just received confirmation. You shouldn't have been on this flight in the first place." Passengers exchanged looks of shock. Some even whispered in disbelief. The black man raised an eyebrow, but remained silent, watching the scene unfold. The woman shook her head, still in denial. "There's been a mistake," she insisted, gripping the seat like it could anchor her. The pilot gave her a pointed look. "No mistake. Security is waiting for you at the gate." The weight of the moment finally hit her. She looked toward the black man, as if searching for some last bit of control, but he didn't even acknowledge her anymore. She was no longer in charge of the situation. Karma had already done its job. The flight attendant stepped forward. The woman had no choice but to grab her bag and shuffle toward the aisle. As she walked past, passengers remained quiet, but the energy in the air was unmistakable. Justice had been served in a way no one expected. And just like that, she was gone. The tension lifted. The flight official turned back to the passengers. "Thank you for your patience," he said. "We'll be departing shortly." The black man exhaled, shaking his head slightly. He didn't need to say anything. Everyone on that plane knew exactly what had just happened. And as the engines rolled to life, one thing was clear: karma had struck, and it had done so in the most unexpected way. As the woman disappeared down the aisle, escorted by the flight attendants, the energy in the cabin shifted. There was no cheering, no loud reactions, just a quiet sense of relief. People exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others letting out small sighs. It was as if the entire plane had been holding its breath, waiting for the chaos to pass. The black man, still seated, adjusted his watch and leaned back slightly. He hadn't spoken much during the whole ordeal, but he didn't need to. His composure had said everything. A few passengers gave him small nods of respect, silent acknowledgements that they had seen what happened, and they stood with him. A flight attendant walked over and offered him a drink. "On the house," she said with a small smile. He chuckled softly, nodding in appreciation. "Thank you," he replied, finally allowing himself to relax. Nearby, the young woman who had spoken up earlier leaned forward. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," she said sincerely. He met her gaze and shrugged lightly. "I've seen worse," he admitted, "but it's always something." She sighed. "Well, at least today, people didn't just sit back and let it happen." He nodded. That was the one thing that had been different this time. People had spoken up. They had refused to let hate win, and that in itself was something worth recognizing. Minutes later, the pilot's voice came over the speakers, announcing that they were finally ready for takeoff. A sense of normalcy settled over the plane as passengers adjusted in their seats, stowed their belongings, and prepared for the journey ahead. As the plane rumbled down the runway, the black man looked out the window, watching the world blur past. He wasn't angry. He wasn't shaken. If anything, he felt a quiet sense of peace. Karma had handled things, just as it always did, and as the aircraft lifted into the sky, leaving the chaos behind, he knew one thing for sure: some lessons in life come fast, and some come hard. Today, she had learned hers at 30,000 feet.